The photograph fell out when she was dusting the third drawer from the top. She had not opened the drawer. She had been running the cloth along the front edge of the desk the way she ran the cloth along every surface in this house, which was efficiently and without particular attention. And the drawer had been slightly open, already a centimeter, maybe 2. The way drawers are left when someone has pulled them out in a hurry and pushed them back without checking the catch. The cloth caught the handle. The drawer slid open another 3 inches, and the photograph, which had been sitting on top of whatever else was inside, slid forward and off the edge and landed face up on the floor between her feet. She picked it up without looking at it. She was still holding the cloth in her other hand, and she looked at the cloth first, and then she looked at the photograph. And she looked at it the way you look at something you picked up off the floor and intend to put back. And then she looked at it again. The man in the photograph was standing in a room she did not recognize. The room had stone walls and a single lamp and a wooden table with a chess set on it. And the man was standing beside the table with his hand on one of the pieces, mid-move or mid-thought, not looking at the camera. He was older than she remembered. His hair had gone fully grey, and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there 11 years ago, and he was thinner than she had ever seen him. But his posture was the same, the slight forward lean of a man who was always in the middle of thinking about something. The way he had stood at the kitchen counter when she was a child, and he was going over numbers in his head, and she would stand beside him and try to follow his eyes without knowing what they were following. Her father had been dead for 11 years. That was what she had been told. That was what her mother had believed. That was the story that had shaped the last 11 years of her life. The story she had built her anger around and her survival around, and the particular quality of her grief around, which was the grief that did not have a body to bury and therefore never fully concluded, just went on and on in the low register of something unfinished. The man in the photograph was not dead. She stood in the middle of Matteo Rinaldi's study with the photograph in her hand and the cloth in her other hand, and the sound of her own pulse, which she could hear in her ears, which was not a sound she usually heard because she was 28 years old and in good health. And she looked at the photograph for what was probably 15 seconds and felt like longer, and then she heard footsteps in the hallway outside the study door, and she put the photograph in the pocket of her apron and closed the drawer and turned back to the desk and was running the cloth along the back edge when the door opened. Matteo Rinaldi came into his own study the way he came into most rooms, which was without announcement and without the particular self-consciousness of a person who believed they needed to signal their arrival. He was on his phone, which was his default state in the mornings, and he came to the desk and pulled out the chair and sat down and looked at whatever was on his screen and did not look at her, which was also his default state in the mornings, and which she had come to understand as the particular blindness of a man who was genuinely inside his own head rather than the performed blindness of a man who wanted to seem busy. She had worked here for 2 months. She had learned the difference. She moved to the bookshelves on the north wall and began there, methodical, her back to him, the cloth moving along the shelves in the way it always moved. And she listened to him on the phone and heard nothing useful and thought about the photograph in her apron pocket and what it meant that it existed and what it meant that it was in this house and what it meant that the man in the photograph was alive. He ended the call. She heard the phone go down on the desk. She heard the sound of him opening the third drawer from the top, and she did not move and did not adjust her breathing and continued moving the cloth along the shelf. And after a moment she heard the drawer close, and then the sound of him opening his laptop. She let herself breathe. She was at the end of the second shelf when she heard it. She had heard it once before, 3 weeks ago, when she was in the kitchen at the end of her shift, and the house had been quiet enough to hear things she usually could not hear. And she had heard a sound from somewhere below the kitchen floor that she had told herself was the heating system, because the heating system in houses this old made sounds, and because the alternative required her to think about things she was not yet ready to think about. She heard it now from the study, which was adjacent to the kitchen, 3 short taps from somewhere below. And she held the cloth still against the shelf and listened, and it did not repeat. She said, without turning. "Is that the heating system?" he said. "What?" she said. "The sound." From downstairs. There was a pause that was approximately 1 beat longer than a pause about a heating system needed to be. He said, "The pipes. Old house," she said. "Yes." She moved to the 3rd shelf and continued. She left the study at 9:15 and went to the kitchen to start the mid-morning cleaning, and she stood at the kitchen sink with the water running and her hands under it and thought about the photograph in her apron pocket and about the 3 short taps and about Matteo Rinaldi's face, which she had not seen when she asked about the sound because she had been looking at the shelf. And she thought about whether that pause had been the pause of a man who was lying or the pause of a man who was deciding how much of the truth to tell. And she thought that sometimes those were the same thing and sometimes they were not, and she did not yet know enough to know which this was. She took the photograph out of her pocket. She looked at it again, her father's hand on the chess piece, the grey of his hair, the stone walls of the room. She turned it over. On the back, in handwriting she did not recognize, a date from 8 months ago. 8 months ago. 8 months ago, he had been in a room with stone walls and a chess set, and someone had taken his photograph. 8 months ago, she had been working at the hotel on the north side, and her mother had been working 2 jobs, and her brother had been finishing his last year of school, and all of them had been living inside the 11-year story of his death. And he had been in a room with stone walls 8 months ago, and the photograph of him in that room was in a drawer in this house. She put the photograph back in her pocket. She turned off the tap. She went to the supply closet and got the mop and began on the kitchen floor. And while she mopped, she looked at the floor and thought about what was below it. And the floor was old hardwood that had been refinished at some point in the last decade and said nothing. And she mopped it anyway and finished it and wrung out the mop and put it away. At 11:30, Matteo came through the kitchen. He did this occasionally not for food, because the cook handled that, but for coffee, which he made himself on the machine in the corner that looked like it belonged in a professional kitchen and that no one else was permitted to operate. A rule that had been explained to her on her first day as Mr. Rinaldi prefers to make his own coffee, which she had understood at the time as eccentricity and now understood as one of the small perimeters he maintained around himself in a house full of people he employed. He made the coffee and stood at the counter while it came through, and she was wiping down the stove on the far side of the kitchen, and neither of them spoke for a while. He said, "You've been here 2 months." She said, "Yes." He said, "Do you like it?" She said, "It's a good house to work in." He said, "That's not what I asked." She turned to look at him. He was looking at his coffee cup rather than at her, which was the way he asked questions. He actually wanted answers, not making eye contact, reducing the pressure, making it possible to say something real. She said, "I like the work. I like that the house is taken seriously." He said, "What does that mean?" She said, "Some houses, you can tell the people in them don't think about the rooms when they leave them. This house, you think about the rooms." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Do I?" She said, "The way things are arranged. Things are put back in the same place. The books on the shelves are in the same order they were in when I got here." He said, "You noticed that?" She said, "I notice a lot of things." He looked at her then. For the first time in the conversation, with the focused attention she had come to know, meant he was filing something. He said, "Yes, I can see that." He took his coffee and left. She stood in the kitchen after he left and felt the photograph in her apron pocket and felt the weight of what she was carrying and thought about the word notice. She noticed things. She had been noticing things for 2 months. The locked door at the bottom of the secondary staircase, which was different from the locked study and the locked wine cellar and the other locked rooms that had explanations. This door had no explanation she had been given, and she had not asked because she had learned in 2 months that asking questions in this house produced answers that were technically true and substantially incomplete. She had noticed that Matteo took a tray from the kitchen 3 times a week, Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and carried it himself to the secondary staircase and came back without it. She had noticed that the tray always had enough food for 1 person and 1 glass of water and 1 cup of whatever hot thing the cook had made that day. She had noticed that he always went alone, and that the door at the bottom of the secondary staircase, which she could hear from the kitchen if she was quiet enough, opened and closed with a sound that was different from the sound of an empty room. She had not put these things together into a conclusion because she had not been ready to have the conclusion. She was ready now. The photograph in her pocket had made her ready. She took it out 1 more time and looked at her father's face in the grey and the stone and the lamplight and thought, he is in this house. She did not know if it was true. She did not have enough to be certain. But the thing in her chest that had been sitting quietly for 2 months, the thing that had made her take this job when the agency offered it, and made her stay when the work was harder than she had expected, and made her notice the locked door and the 3 times a week tray and the sounds below the floor, that thing, which she had not let herself name, said he is in this house, and you have been circling it for 2 months because you were not ready to know. She put the photograph back in her pocket and went to start on the upstairs bathrooms and thought about what she was going to do next. And the thought was not a plan yet. It was just a direction, and the direction was down. She started keeping a log. Not written down, she was not going to write anything down in this house. Not with the quality of attention she had observed in Matteo Rinaldi, who noticed when books were out of order on his own shelves, and who would certainly notice a notebook that had not been there before. The log was in her head, which was where she kept most things that mattered, and it was organized the way she organized everything, which was chronologically and with attention to the gaps. Monday. He left the kitchen at 12:40 with a tray that held a bowl of the minestrone the cook had made, a glass of water, a bread roll, and a small cup of espresso. She watched him from the hallway that connected the kitchen to the formal dining room, standing at an angle that kept her visible if he turned but didn't make her appear to be watching. He didn't turn. He went to the secondary staircase at the end of the east corridor, unlocked the door at the bottom with a key he kept on a separate ring from the main household keys, went through, and the door closed behind him. She counted. He came back 11 minutes later with the empty tray. The espresso cup was not on the tray. She noted this. Either he had left it below or whoever was below had kept it. She thought about what it meant that whoever was below had kept it, and then she stopped thinking about it, because thinking about it made her feel something she was not ready to feel in the middle of a workday. Wednesday. Same tray. Different food. The cook had made chicken that day, and there was a portion of it with roasted vegetables and a roll and a glass of water, and the espresso. He went at 12:30 this time. She was in the east corridor doing the baseboards, which gave her a direct line of sight to the secondary staircase, without requiring her to position herself in any way that could be read as watching. He came back in 14 minutes. The espresso cup was not on the tray again. She also noted, this time, that he paused at the bottom of the secondary staircase before he relocked the door, with his hand on the key and his forehead almost, but not quite touching the door, for approximately 3 seconds. Then he locked it and came back down the corridor, and she was looking at the baseboard when he passed her, and he said, without stopping, "You missed a spot." She looked. She had not missed a spot. She understood that he was telling her he had seen her, and she understood that he was not going to say anything else about it. Friday. She did not watch from the corridor. She had been watching from the corridor twice, and she was not going to make it 3 times, because 3 times was a pattern, and patterns were visible. She went to the supply closet at the far end of the kitchen wing and found a reason to be there, reorganizing the cleaning supplies in an order that was marginally more logical than the previous order. And she listened. She heard him come to the kitchen at 12:25. She heard the tray preparation, the clink of a bowl, the sound of the coffee machine. which he always operated himself even for the tray, which she had noted in her first week as unusual and had filed without conclusion. She heard him go. She heard the secondary staircase door. She did not hear it come back open for 16 minutes this time, which was longer than Monday and longer than Wednesday. And she stood in the supply closet with a bottle of floor cleaner in each hand and thought about what a person does in 16 minutes in a stone room with a chess set and a lamp. After Friday, she knew enough about the schedule. What she did not know was the door. The door at the bottom of the secondary staircase was the problem. It was the original door of the house in that section, which meant it was solid and old, and the lock was a deadbolt that required the specific key from the specific ring, and the specific ring lived in Matteo's jacket pocket during the day and, she assumed, somewhere equally inaccessible at night. She had thought about the possibilities and arrived at the same conclusion each time she could not get through the door without the key. And she could not get the key without either asking for it or taking it, and both of those options required a conversation she was not yet ready to have because she did not yet have enough of the picture. To have the conversation from the right position, she needed more. She went looking for more in the places available to her, which were the rooms she was permitted to clean and the conversations she was able to have without raising suspicion. The study, which she returned to on Thursday with fresh eyes and a different quality of attention. She had already replaced the photograph exactly as it had been when she found it. She knew precisely because she had memorized its position before she put it in her pocket, the angle, the distance from the drawer edge, and she had replaced it with that same precision when she returned it 2 days later. She did not take it again. She did not need to. She had looked at it long enough to memorize what mattered: the stone walls, the chess set, the lamp, the date on the back, and the grey of her father's hair. In the study, she looked at things differently now. The bookshelves had books on chess, 3 of them, a collection that was specific enough to be personal rather than decorative. She noted this. There was a framed photograph on the desk that she had dusted around for 2 months without examining, and she examined it now. A younger version of Matteo with an older man who was probably his father, standing outside a building she did not recognize. No other photographs on the desk. No photographs anywhere in the study except that one, which told her the study was a working room and not a room where he displayed things that mattered to him personally, which told her the things that mattered to him personally were elsewhere, and the photograph in the drawer was in the drawer rather than on the desk for a reason. She thought about that reason and arrived at the only conclusion that made sense. The photograph in the drawer was something he looked at regularly enough to want accessible, but did not want visible to anyone who came into the room, which meant it was something he looked at for reasons that were not professional and not casual. She thought about a man who kept a photograph of someone in a drawer where he could reach it, and she thought about the 11 minutes, and the 14 minutes, and the 16 minutes, and the espresso cup that was never on the tray when he came back. And she thought that the relationship between Matteo Rinaldi and the man in the stone room below was not the relationship of a jailer and a prisoner. Or not only that, and she did not know what to do with that thought, so she put it in the part of her mind where she put things she was not ready to resolve and continued dusting the study. The conversation happened on a Tuesday, which was not one of the tray days, which was possibly why she let it happen. She was less guarded on Tuesdays, less occupied with the secondary staircase and the key ring and the sound of the door, and she was in the kitchen making inventory for the cook when Matteo came in, not for coffee but for a glass of water, which was unusual, and he stood at the counter with the glass and looked at the kitchen in a way that was different from his usual way of looking at the kitchen, which was not looking at it at all. He said, "How old are you?" She said, 28. He said, "You're young to be doing this work." She said, "I'm good at it." He said, "I know. That's not what I meant." She kept her eyes on the inventory list and said, "What did you mean?" He was quiet for a moment, and she heard him set the glass down. He said, "You're careful. Unusually careful for someone your age. Most people your age are still figuring out how to be careful." She said, Some people learn early, he said. Yes. What teaches you? She said. Loss. Usually. The word was out before she had decided to say it, and she kept her eyes on the list and her pen moving and waited for whatever he said next. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, Yes, that's usually how it works. He picked up the glass and left. She stood in the kitchen with her pen still moving on the inventory list and thought about the word loss in his mouth, which had not been a deflection. He had received it directly, the way you receive a word that applies to you. She thought about a man who kept a photograph in a drawer and carried a tray 3 times a week and paused at a locked door with his forehead almost touching the wood. And she thought that whatever the relationship between them was, it was not uncomplicated, and it had been going on for 11 years. And she did not know what to do with a complication that large, in a situation she was already struggling to hold steadily. She did not let herself think about the other thing, which was the way he had looked at her when she said she noticed a lot of things, and the way she had felt when he looked at her like that, which was seen, which was the specific quality of discomfort that came from being seen by someone you were simultaneously investigating and could not entirely make yourself regard as only that. She did not let herself think about it because it was not relevant and because it was dangerous and because the photograph was in her apron pocket and her father was 11 years gone and either dead or not dead, and until she knew which, everything else was noise. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table in her apartment and called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring and said how was she, and she said fine, and her mother said, you sound tired, and she said I am, and her mother said, come home this weekend, and she said, maybe, and her mother said, your brother asked about you, and she said tell him I asked about him too, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing that was the thing they were actually talking about, which was the way they had talked since her father disappeared. Everything said slightly sideways of the real subject. And when she ended the call, she sat for a while in the quiet of her apartment and thought about stone walls and chess sets and espresso cups that were never on the tray when he came back. Her father had always kept an espresso cup on his desk when he worked. It was a detail she had not thought about in years and that came back to her now with the specific clarity of details that have been stored intact rather than processed, sitting somewhere undisturbed and emerging whole when the right key found them. He kept a small cup on the corner of whatever surface he was working at. When it was empty, he didn't move to refill it, immediately left it there. Empty. As a kind of place marker. She had asked him once why he didn't get up and refill it, and he had said, because the walk to get more coffee is something to look forward to when I finish the next section. And she had been 12 and had not fully understood that, but had understood enough to file it as one of the things that was particularly his. She sat at her own kitchen table and thought about an espresso cup that was never on the tray when he came back, and she felt something crack open in her chest, quietly, in the way of things that have been sealed for a long time and open not with force, but with the specific pressure of a truth that has been waiting. She put her hand flat on the table and pressed down and felt the solidity of it and said to herself, tomorrow. Tomorrow turned out to be the following Wednesday. Not the Wednesday immediately after she had told herself tomorrow, and then spent 3 days adjusting what she meant by that. Because the thing she was planning required a quality of stillness she had not yet arrived at, and she understood from experience that acting before she was still enough produced mistakes she could not afford. She went to work on the Wednesday after. She went to work on the Thursday. She went on Friday and watched him carry the tray and counted 16 minutes again and went home and sat at her kitchen table and did not call her mother. She went on the following Monday and the following Wednesday, and on the Wednesday evening she went home and sat at her kitchen table and said, tomorrow, out loud to the empty apartment, and this time she meant it in the way that made it true. She arrived at the house the following morning at 7, which was her usual time, and she went through the usual morning routine with the usual efficiency and the usual quality of attention, and she felt the photograph in her apron pocket, which she had taken to carrying every day, because she was not comfortable leaving it at home, and she was not comfortable leaving it in the drawer, and the apron pocket was the only available third option. She cleaned the downstairs rooms, and she cleaned the upstairs rooms, and she ate lunch in the staff room with the cook, who was a woman named Katerina, who talked about her grandchildren and occasionally about Matteo in the sideways way that people who have worked for someone a long time talk about them, which was fondly and with the particular exasperation of someone who had seen a person at their worst and decided to stay anyway. Katerina said, pouring coffee. "He hasn't eaten the dinner I sent down in 3 days," Sofia said. "What dinner?" Katerina said. "The tray. He doesn't always finish it. But 3 days." She shook her head. Sofia said, "Is he unwell?" Katerina said, "He's not sleeping. You can tell when he's not sleeping because he makes his own coffee at 5 in the morning and the machine makes a sound." Sofia said, "I've heard it." Katerina said, "He gets like this sometimes, when something is on his mind." She poured her own cup and sat down and added sugar and said, "He's a difficult man to work for and a difficult man to understand, but he's not a bad man. I want you to know that. I've worked for bad men, and I know the difference." Sofia looked at her coffee cup and said, "What makes the difference?" Katerina said, "A bad man doesn't carry his own tray." She said it simply, as if it were self-evident, and drank her coffee. And Sofia thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. She was alone in the kitchen at 5:30, after Katerina had gone and before the evening staff arrived, which was a window of approximately 20 minutes that she had identified 3 weeks ago and confirmed several times since. The kitchen was quiet. The house was in the specific late afternoon state of suspended activity, when the day's work was largely done and the evenings had not yet begun, and there were perhaps 2 other people anywhere on the premises, both of them in the east wing on the far side of the house. She stood at the kitchen sink and filled a glass with water and drank half of it and set it down and looked at the floor. The floor was old hardwood, dark with age and refinishing, and it ran from the kitchen through the east corridor and into the secondary staircase alcove where the door was. She had walked on this floor every day for 2 months. She knew its sounds, the particular creak near the refrigerator, the section near the door to the pantry that was slightly hollow under her left foot, the way the boards were tighter and quieter near the walls than in the middle. She was not thinking about the floor. She was thinking about what was below it. She put her glass down and crouched. She put both palms flat on the floor, the way she had done once at her own kitchen table, and she pressed down and felt the solidity of the old wood and the cold coming up through it from below, and she thought about stone walls and a single lamp and a chess set and 11 years, and she thought, if you're there, and you can hear me." She knocked 3 times, with the knuckle of her right hand, against the floor, in the rhythm she had heard from below, in the rhythm she had recognized, without letting herself recognize it, for 3 weeks. The rhythm of a man sitting and thinking with his hand on a surface, 3 soft strikes, evenly spaced, the way a finger drums when the mind is elsewhere. The kitchen was silent. She stayed crouched, both palms on the floor, and she did not breathe, and she listened, and she thought maybe she was wrong. Maybe it was the heating system, the old pipes, the settling of a house that was 90 years old and had a right to make sounds. Maybe the rhythm she had heard was a coincidence, and the photograph was explained by something she had not yet thought of, and the espresso cups were explained by something she had not yet thought of, and the 3 minutes Matteo spent with his forehead almost touching the door before he relocked it were explained by something she had not yet thought of. And then, from below, she heard it, 3 soft strikes, evenly spaced. The same rhythm returned to her from the other side of the floor, from somewhere in the stone and the dark below, and she felt it through her palms before she heard it with her ears, the vibration traveling up through the old wood and into her hands. And the sound was unmistakable, and the rhythm was unmistakable, and she sat down on the kitchen floor with both hands still pressed against it, and could not, for a moment, do anything at all. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and this was not the moment for it, and she did not. What she did was sit on the kitchen floor for approximately 90 seconds, with her hands pressed flat and her eyes closed, and her breath coming in and out in the measured way of someone managing something very large in a very small space. And then she opened her eyes and stood up and went to the sink and ran the cold water and put her wrists under it, which was something her mother had taught her to do when she was young and needed to come back to herself quickly. And she stood there until she was back. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She went to the secondary staircase alcove and stood in front of the locked door and put her hand on it, flat, the way she had put her hands on the floor. The door was heavy and cold and old and said nothing. She stood there for a moment, and then she heard footsteps at the far end of the east corridor, and she moved away from the door and back into the main kitchen and was at the counter with her inventory, clipboard, when Matteo came around the corner. He stopped when he saw her. He had his jacket on, which meant he had just come in from somewhere, and he was carrying the separate key ring, which meant he was on his way to the secondary staircase. He looked at her, and then at the clipboard, and then at her face. She kept her face arranged in the expression she used when she was managing something, which was neutral and occupied. And she said, "I'm finishing the supply check for Katerina." He said, "All right." He moved past her toward the secondary staircase alcove, and she kept her eyes on the clipboard and her pen moving, and she heard the deadbolt and the door, and his footsteps on what must be stairs below, and she stood at the counter and thought about his face in the moment before he looked away, which was the face of a man who had seen something in her expression that he was not certain he had seen correctly and was deciding whether to ask about it. He came back in 13 minutes. The kitchen was still empty except for her. He set the empty tray on the counter and she said, without looking up, "Katerina says he hasn't been finishing the dinners." A pause. She had not planned to say it. It came out in the particular way of things that have been pressing on you and find the first available gap. She heard him be very still. She said, "Still?" Looking at the clipboard. "Is he unwell?" Another pause. Longer. The kind that told her he was deciding how to answer something that was not really about the question she had asked. He said, "He has days that are harder than others." She said, "Yes." She kept her pen moving. He said, "Sofia." She looked up. He was looking at her with the full directness she had seen before, and that she was coming to understand was not hostility but was simply what happened when he was no longer managing the distance between himself and a conversation. He said, "What do you know?" She said, "I know someone is in the room below this kitchen, and that you've been carrying food to that room 3 times a week for as long as anyone in this house remembers, and that you carry it yourself, and don't let anyone else go near that staircase." She said it the way she had practiced saying it, which was calmly and in the correct order. He looked at her. He said, "How long have you known?" She said, "Long enough." He said, "That's not an answer." She said, "No, it isn't." She set the clipboard down on the counter and looked at him and said, "Who is in that room?" He was very still for a long time, long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. And then he said, "Someone who had nowhere else to go." She said, "That's also not an answer." He said, "It's all of the answer I have that's honest." She said, "What does that mean?" He looked at the clipboard on the counter between them, and then at the secondary staircase door at the end of the alcove, and then at her. He said, "It means that the full answer requires you to know things I don't know if you're ready to know, and I don't know enough about you to judge whether you're ready. And I've been trying to understand that for 2 months." She said, 2 months. He said, "Since the day you arrived." She said, "You've been watching me." He said, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you remind me of someone." He said it the way he said things that cost him, which was quietly and without inflection. And she felt the floor solid under her feet and the photograph in her apron pocket and the vibration of 3 taps still in her palms, and she said, "Who?" He looked at her and said, "I think you already know." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere in the house, A clock was ticking, the old one in the front hallway that she wound every Monday as part of the routine, and the sound of it came through the walls, small and steady and indifferent to everything happening in this room. She reached into her apron pocket and took out the photograph. She set it on the counter between them, face up, the same way he had left it, face up in the drawer. She looked at his face when he looked at it. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have looked at many times and that still has not become ordinary. She said nothing. She waited for him to look at her, and when he did, she saw it not guilt, not calculation, not the prepared expression of a man who has rehearsed this conversation. She saw the face of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment for a very long time and had hoped, in the way that people hope for things they know they do not deserve, that it would not come. And now that it had come, he was not running from it, and he was not explaining it away. And what was in his face was the thing that the title had promised, the thing she had not understood when she first read it in the expression of a person she thought she was beginning to know. It was heartbreak, quiet and complete. The heartbreak of a man who understood in this moment exactly what he had done and to whom, and had no version of himself available that made it other than what it was. She said, "That's my father." He did not deny it. He did not say anything at all. She picked up the photograph and put it back in her pocket and stood in the kitchen with the old clock ticking through the walls and thought about what happened next. He was the one who spoke first. She had expected to be the one who spoke. She had come into this moment with the photograph in her pocket and the vibration of 3 taps still in her palms and 2 months of carefully constructed composure. And she had expected that composure to serve her now, to let her say what needed to be said in the correct order and without excess. But he spoke first, and what he said was not a defense and was not an explanation and was not the thing you say when you are buying time. He said, "I know I don't have the right to ask you to listen to me." She said nothing. She waited. He said, "But I'm going to ask anyway." He turned from the counter and went to the secondary staircase alcove and stood in front of the locked door with his back to her and his hand on the key ring in his pocket. And she watched him stand there the way she had watched him stand there through the corner of her eye on Wednesday, the particular posture of a man who was having a conversation with a door that the door could not participate in. And then he turned around and said, "Sit down, Sofia." She said, "I'd rather stand." He looked at her. He said, "All right." He stayed where he was, by the door, the key ring in his hand now, not the door, just holding the ring. She thought about the weight of it. He said, 11 years ago I gave an order." He said it the way she had come to understand. He said things that had weight flatly, without softening, in the precise register of a man who had decided that accuracy was the only thing he could offer. The order was to bring a man to me who had information about my operations that made him dangerous to have in the open. The man was your father. She said nothing. He said, "The order I gave was not an order to harm him. I want you to know that. And I know that saying it doesn't change what happened. And I know you may not believe it. And I'm telling you anyway because it's true." He looked at the key ring in his hand. "The men I sent found him before he could do what he was planning to do with the information he had, which was to go to the authorities. I brought him here." He paused. "I brought him here because when I met him, when I actually sat across from him and looked at him, I couldn't do what the situation required." She said, "What did the situation require?" He said, "You know what it required. The kitchen was very quiet." She said, "Say it." He said, "The situation required that I remove the threat permanently." He said it without inflection, the flat language of a world she had known existed and had never been inside. And she held it and said, "But you didn't." He said, "No." She said, "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "He saved my life 3 years before. He was working for the operation then, doing the books, and there was a meeting that went wrong, and he was the only person in the room who was not supposed to be a problem, and he stepped in front of something that was coming for me." He paused. He didn't know me. He had no reason. He just did it. He looked at the key ring. I told myself it was strategy. I told myself I was keeping him because he was useful, because he knew things, because releasing him was more dangerous than holding him. All of those things were also true, but they were not the reason. She said, "The reason was that you owed him." He said, "Yes." She said, "And so you put him in a room." He said, "Yes." She said, "For 11 years." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you told no one he was alive." He said, "Yes." She said, "And my mother has believed for 11 years that he was dead." He said, "Yes." Each answer came back to her the same way, flat, precisi, undefended, and she received each one and felt the specific weight of it, and did not look away, and did not fill the silence between them with anything, because the silence was the most honest thing in the room right now, and she was not going to cover it with noise. She said, "Why didn't you let him go?" It was the question she had been building to, the one underneath all the others, the one that had a different texture than the rest. He said, "Because I was afraid." She said, "Of what?" He said, "Of what he would do when he got out, of what he knew and what he could do with it, of what it would mean for everyone in this house and everyone associated with this operation if the wrong information reached the wrong people." He said it, and then he said, "And because after a certain amount of time the question of letting him go became inseparable from the question of what I had already done to him, and I couldn't answer the second question without answering the first. And I was not able to answer the first." She said, "You were afraid of the accounting." He said, "Yes." She said, "And so you kept him." He said, "Yes." She looked at him across the kitchen and thought about the word kept, which was the word she had chosen rather than the word held or imprisoned or confined. And she thought about how kept was also what you did with a promise, and what you did with a secret, and what you did with something you did not want to lose. And she thought that the word was accurate in more directions than she had intended when she said it. She said, "Does he know why he's still here?" He said, "He knows what I've told him, which is that releasing him is complicated and that I'm working on a solution." She said, "Is that true?" He said, "The second part, for the last 3 years. Yes, I've been trying to find a way to let him go that doesn't destroy everything, including him." She said, "What changed 3 years ago?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I got older, and I started to understand that what I was doing was not protection. It was easier than the alternative, and I was tired of things that were just easier than the alternative." She said, "And what is the alternative?" He said, "Bringing the information he has to the right people, people who can use it in the right direction, who have enough power to make it safe for him to resurface." He said, "It takes time. It requires trusting people I'm not used to trusting and dismantling things I built specifically not to be dismantled." She said, "But you're doing it." He said, "Yes." She said, "Were you going to tell him?" He said, "When I had something real to tell him, when I could say, here is the date, here is the plan, here is how it ends." She said, "And me." He said, "I didn't know who you were when you arrived. I suspected by the end of the first week. I confirmed it at the end of the first month." She said, "How?" He said, "You have his posture, the way you stand when you're thinking, the way you hold your shoulders when you're managing something difficult." He said it simply, and she felt it land in the strange way of things that are both a blow and something else, something she didn't have a word for. She said, "And you didn't tell me." He said, "No." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I didn't know how. Because every version of telling you required me to be what I am in a way I couldn't find the language for." He looked at the key ring. "Because I was afraid of what you would see when you looked at me if you knew." The kitchen was very quiet. The clock in the front hallway ticked. She stood with both hands at her sides and looked at him across the room. At the key ring in his hand, and the locked door behind him, and the 11 years between them that were not her years and not his years, but her father's years. Slow and stone, walled and lit by a single lamp. She thought about the photograph in the drawer. She thought about the espresso cup. She thought about a man who had said a bad man doesn't carry his own tray. And she thought about what kind of a man carried the tray and kept the person there and was not a bad man in the way Katerina meant, but was also not bad in the way the situation required examining. She said, "I want to see him." He said, "Yes." She said, "Now." He said, "Yes." He looked at the keyring in his hand and then at her and said, "Sofia." She looked at him. He said, "I need you to know that I understand what I've done. I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm not asking you to understand it. I'm asking you to let me open the door." She said, "Open the door." He turned to the secondary staircase alcove and put the key in the lock, and she heard the deadbolt release for the first time, not through a wall or a floor, but directly in front of her. And the door swung open, and there were stairs going down into the kind of light that comes from a lamp. Warm and specific. Not overhead light, but the light of a room that someone has arranged for habitation and for the long passage of time. He did not go first. He stepped aside and held the door and looked at her, and she understood that this was the first of the things he could do, rather than the things he could only have done and did not. And she walked past him to the top of the stairs and looked down. The stone walls were exactly what the photograph had shown. The lamp was on the table beside the chess set. The room was larger than she had expected, not a cell, not a punishment space, but something that was trying to be livable in the way of something that knew it was not quite that and was working with what it had: bookshelves along one wall, a real bed with actual linens, a desk with papers on it, a window high in the wall near the ceiling that let in a rectangle of sky that was already darkening toward evening. And at the desk, with his back to the stairs, with his hand on the surface, in the particular posture of a man whose body remembers a habit, even when the mind has moved elsewhere. 3 soft taps, evenly spaced, was her father. He was older. He was thinner. His hair was fully grey. He was exactly the man in the photograph, and he was exactly the man she had spent 11 years carrying around in the specific silent way of a grief that has no body to bury. And she stood at the top of the stairs and looked at him and said nothing, because there was no word available for what was happening in her chest, and she was not going to substitute a lesser word for the thing itself. He stopped tapping. He turned around slowly, as if he had learned to be careful with sudden movements in a space where there was nowhere to go, and he looked up the stairs, and he saw her. And his face did the thing that her mother's face did sometimes when she thought no one was watching the unguarded thing. The thing underneath, the thing you show people, and he said, very quietly, "Sofia." She went down the stairs. She did not run, and she did not speak. She walked down each step in the particular deliberate way of someone who is choosing to arrive rather than to fall. And when she reached the bottom, she crossed the stone floor and put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the stone room under the high window with the chess set on, the table and the lamp casting its warm, specific light, and neither of them said anything for a very long time. Behind her, at the top of the stairs, she heard the door stay open. She did not hear it close. She noted this and filed it in the way she filed things that were true and that she was not yet ready to fully examine. And she held on to her father in the stone room and felt him hold on to her and thought about the word kept and all the directions it moved in and the one she had not named yet, which was this: some things are kept because you cannot let them go, and some things are kept because you are terrified of what they mean when they leave, and some things are kept because the only honest answer to what you've done is to stay in proximity to it until you understand it well enough to know how to end it. And she did not know yet which of those was true, and she was not going to decide tonight. Tonight, she was in a stone room at the bottom of a staircase, with her father's arms around her, and the door at the top left open, and that was enough. Her father knew she was there. He told her this after a while, when they had separated, and she had sat down on the edge of the bed, and he had sat in his desk chair, and they were looking at each other across the stone. room, in the particular way of people who have a great deal to say and are deciding what order to say it in. He told her he had heard her voice the third week she was in the house. She had been in the kitchen above him, saying something to the cook, and the particular acoustic quality of the stone and the old wood had carried her voice down to him with a clarity that had made him put both hands flat on his desk and sit without moving for several minutes. He said, "I thought I was wrong. I've thought other things were you before. Sounds that turned out to be nothing." He looked at his hands, but I kept listening, and after a while I stopped thinking I was wrong. She said, "Why didn't you do something?" He said, "What would I have done?" She said, "I don't know." Made noise. Found a way to signal. He said, "I didn't want you to come down here unprepared, and I didn't know what was going to happen when you found out. I didn't know if it would put you in danger." He paused. "I didn't know if he was going to tell you, or if you were going to find out another way, and I didn't know which was better." She said, "He kept the photograph in a drawer." Her father said, "I know he did. He told me he was keeping it. He asked me for it." She looked at him. He said, "He comes down, and we talk. We have for years. It's not what it should be, but it's what it is." She said, "You talk to him." He said, "Sofia, I've been in this room for 11 years. I would have talked to the wall if the wall could answer." She heard the particular flatness of that sentence, which was not self-pity, but was something more specific and harder, the accurate description of a duration that could not be softened by framing it differently, and she received it without trying to soften it. She said, "Are you angry at him?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I was, for a long time. I was very angry for the first several years." He looked at the chess set on the table. "Then I got tired, and then something else happened, which was that I started to understand that what he was dealing with from the inside of his situation was not simple. What he did was wrong. What he's been doing since is, I don't have a word for it. It's not right either, but it's different from what he did in the beginning." She said, "He kept you here." He said, "Yes." She said, "For 11 years." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's not different." He said, "No, it's the same action, but the reason changed, and the reason matters even when the action is still the same action." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to understand that. I'm telling you what happened to me in 11 years of thinking about it. You don't have to arrive at the same place." She sat with that for a while. Outside the high window, the sky had gone fully dark, and the lamp on the table was the only light in the room, and it made everything warm and specific in the way of light that is trying to be sufficient and is almost enough. She thought about the word "kept" again and the directions it moved in, and she thought about Matteo at the top of the stairs with the door open, and she thought about 11 years of trays carried personally, and espresso cups never returned, and a forehead almost touching a door, and a photograph in a drawer that was taken because he asked for it. And she thought about all of that and did not know what to do with it, and said so. She said, "I don't know what to do with any of this." Her father said, "You don't have to know tonight." She said, "That's what he said." Her father looked at her with the expression she remembered from childhood, the one he used when she had said something that revealed more than she intended, and he said nothing, which was the most communicative response available. She said, "Don't." He said, "I didn't say anything." She said, "You were going to." He said, "I was going to say that you've been here 2 months, and you came here for a reason, and the reason was me. And that means you chose to be in a house with a man you believed was responsible for my death, which required a particular kind of courage or a particular kind of anger. And I'm wondering which it was." She said, "Both." He said, "Yes, I thought so." He looked at his hands again. "The anger is easier to carry, but the courage is more useful." She said, "Is that advice?" He said, "It's an observation. I've had a long time to observe things." She said, 11 years. He said, 11 years. He said it without self-pity and without drama. in the tone of a man who had processed his situation down to its actual dimensions, rather than the dimensions it felt like. And she thought that this was what happened to a person who spent a very long time alone with nothing to do but understand things. She said, "I'm going to get you out." He said, "I know." She said, "Not tonight, but I'm going to." He said, "I know that too." She said, "He says he's been working on it. For 3 years, he says there are people he's been talking to." Her father said, "Yes, I believe him." She said, "I don't know if I believe him." He said, "That's fair. You've known him 2 months. I've known him 11 years. She said, "That's a strange argument for trusting someone." He said, "It's not an argument for trusting him. It's an argument for the fact that I have more information than you do." He looked at her steadily. "What I can tell you is this. The thing he's been trying to do for the last 3 years is genuinely complicated and genuinely dangerous, and he is doing it anyway. That doesn't make what came before it right. But it's a fact, and facts should be part of the picture." She said, "You're defending him." He said, "I'm describing him accurately. There's a difference." She said, "Is there?" He said, "Sofia." She looked at him. He said, "I spent the first 4 years in this room hating him. The next 4 years, understanding him. The last 3 years watching him try to do something that costs him more than he's letting you see." He paused. "I'm not asking you to trust him. I'm asking you to hold the picture without deciding what it means before you have all of it." She said, "All right," he said. "All right." They sat in the stone room, and the lamp held its warm light, and the chess pieces stood in their positions on the table, mid-game or mid-thought. And she thought about a man who came down 3 times a week and sat across a chessboard from her father and talked. And she thought about what a person talks about for 11 years. And she thought she probably did not want to know, and she thought she probably needed to know eventually, and she thought she was not ready for eventually tonight. She stayed in the stone room for 2 hours. They talked about her mother, which was the first thing and the longest thing. Her father asking questions with the careful patience of someone who has been rationing their asking for a long time and knows the information has to last. She told him her mother was well and working and had not stopped. He said that sounded right. She told him about her brother, who was 22 now and in his last year of an engineering degree, and who had their father's forward lean and their mother's stubbornness, and who did not know what Sofia knew and was not going to know until there was something concrete to tell him. Her father said that sounded right too. He asked about Sofia herself, in the way of a parent who has missed a decade and is trying to understand what they have missed without making the person feel observed. And she answered as accurately as she could, which was the only way she knew how to answer things. And he listened with the full attention of someone for whom the sound of his daughter's voice was not something he took for granted. At some point she heard footsteps at the top of the stairs, and she looked up, and Matteo was there, not coming down, just standing at the top with his hand on the doorframe and his face doing the thing she had seen in the kitchen. And heartbreak that was quiet and completed. He looked at her and at her father and said, "I'll be in the study when you're ready." Then he went away, and the sound of his footsteps receded down the corridor, and the stone room was quiet again except for the lamp. Her father said, "He's been doing that for 3 years, leaving the door open." She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I think it means he can't figure out how to close it." She said, "It's still locked from the outside." He said, "Yes, but he's been standing at the top with the door open for 3 years. That's not nothing." She said, "It's not enough." He said, "No, but it's not nothing." She went upstairs at some point after 9. She did not say goodbye the way you say goodbye to someone you are leaving. She said it the way you say it to someone you are coming back to, which was briefly and with the specific weight of an intention rather than a farewell. Her father said he would be there when she came back, which was a small joke and a true thing. And she went up the stairs and through the door into the kitchen, which was dark now except for the light over the stove that was always left on. And she stood in the kitchen for a moment, and then she went to the study. Matteo was at his desk. He was not on the phone, and he was not on his laptop. He was sitting with his hands on the desk surface and looking at nothing in particular, in the posture of a man who has been waiting and knows the waiting is not something he has earned the right to rush. He looked up when she came in. She came to the desk and stood across from him, and they looked at each other in the lamplight of the study, which was a different quality of light from the stone room below, but was also warm and specific. And she said, "I'm coming back tomorrow." He said, "I know." She said, "And the day after." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not doing this for you." He said, "I know that too." She said, "I need you to tell me everything you've done in the last 3 years. Every person you've talked to and every arrangement you've made, and how far along it is, and what it needs, and how long it will take." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I need you to understand that I am the one who decides when it's enough. Not you. Not the timeline. Me." He said, "Yes." She said, "And when it's done, when he's actually out, and my mother knows he's alive, and my brother knows he's alive, and I'm going to decide what I think about everything else. Not before." He looked at her across the desk and said, "That's fair." She said, "It's not fair. It's what I have." He said, "Yes." He said it the way he said things that were simply true, without addition or apology, and she stood in the study doorway and thought about her father in the stone room, saying it's not nothing, and thought about the door left open for 3 years, and thought about 11 years of trays and espresso cups and the photograph in the drawer. And she thought that she was going to need a great deal of time to understand what all of this amounted to, and that the time was going to start now, and that she had not chosen this and was in it anyway, which was the shape of most things that mattered. She said, "Good night." He said, "Good night, Sofia." She went to the door and was almost through it when she turned back. Not because she had planned to, but because there was one more thing, and she was not going to leave it unsaid. She said, "He told me you asked for the photograph." Matteo was very still. She said, "I'm not telling you that because it changes anything. I'm telling you because you should know that I know. And because—" She stopped. She looked at the desk and then at him. "Because some things are true even when they're not enough, and I think you should know that I can see the difference." He looked at her across the study and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet." She went out into the hallway, and the house was quiet around her, and the clock in the front hallway was still ticking in its indifferent way. And she got her coat and her bag from the staff room and went out into the November night and stood on the front step for a moment looking at the street. The street was ordinary. The city was doing its ordinary night things. Somewhere below her the stone room was warm and lit, and her father was sitting at his desk with his hand resting on the surface in the particular way of a man whose body remembers a habit. And somewhere behind her in the study, a man was sitting at his own desk in a different quality of stillness than the one he had inhabited for 11 years. The stillness of something that had finally been named. She stood on the front step and breathed the cold air and thought about tomorrow, which was coming regardless of whether she was ready for it. And she thought that not ready, and in it anyway, was a condition she was familiar with, and that she had managed it before and would manage it again. She went home. She called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring and said, "How are you?" And she said, "I need to tell you something." And her mother said, "What is it?" And she said, "I need you to sit down first." And her mother sat down, and Sofia told her. The call lasted a long time. When it ended, she sat in the quiet of her apartment and looked at the photograph, which she had taken out of her apron pocket and set on the kitchen table. Her father, with his hand on the chess-piece and the grey of his hair and the stone walls behind him. And she thought about what living sounds like when you have been listening for it through a floor for 3 months, and then it answers back in a rhythm you recognize. And she thought that it sounded exactly like this. 3 soft strikes. evenly spaced, the ordinary percussion of a mind at work, continuing.